the population that I chose to research was foster parents and foster children. I'll focus more on the foster children as they're definitely the more vulnerable population. So, foster parents are the adults that are the caretaker guardians of these children that are displaced from their biological homes. They act as a temporary parent for these children. They may have biological children of their own, and they may or may not be relatives of the children that they foster. 63% of these couples or families that foster are led by a heterosexual married couple, followed by 30% are single female households, and then a smaller percentage, 3%, is an LGBT couple. The majority of these couples are white, and then followed by Black, and then Hispanic. The children, foster children are children that are unable to be safely cared for by their biological parents, whether it's in regards to abuse, neglect, either whatever situation, it was unsafe for them to stay and they needed to be moved temporarily at least in order to be safe. The majority of foster children are white, followed by Black, and then Hispanic, and 11% are other. The placement settings that they typically are in are usually non-relative, followed by a relative. And then other situations make up a smaller percentage, such as institutions, group homes, trial home visits, pre-adoptive homes, runaway, and then supervised independent living. And the outcomes, the majority of them, almost 50%, are reunification, which is the ideal goal for foster care, and then followed by adopted, and then emancipated, which is, we'll get to that and how that plays a big part into the health issues these children face. And then the others are just other living situations, such as living with a relative or living with a friend. So I couldn't find any really great statistics on international foster care. A lot of the statistics I found from like UNICEF and dealt more with orphans, although it was interesting. There's some, at least like 2 million children that they say, are placed in residential homes or care, but they think that this number is a lot higher because in many countries, if there's a single parent that feels like they can't care for their child, they will have them placed in these situations just because they feel like they'll have better health outcomes, better educational opportunities, things like that. But here in the US, there are about 442,995 children in foster care. That was in September of 2017. In Utah, in 2019, there were only 1,996 children in foster care. So you compare that to the state that had the most children in foster care, which was California at 51,869, and that's a pretty significant difference. The state average, or the average for, this average that most states had in foster care, was 8,482. So Utah is definitely at the lower end. And hopefully that means that there's not that great of a need, and not that the need of, there's underreported children that are facing abuse and neglect. Contributing factors are social determinants of health. There's several of these for these kids. Social norms and attitudes are a big one. These foster children are often criticized, they're discriminated against, especially as they get older. Their opportunities for better placement and adoption and even reunification decrease quite a bit. Social support is a big issue. They obviously struggle with family support. They move around so much, they have a hard time making secure friendships, and that plays a big part into their outcomes. They often come from poverty living situations, which decreases many of the opportunities for any of our just the basic cares of life. The quality of education is a big one. unfortunately, these are some sad statistics. Can't talk. That only 25% of these kids that age out of foster care do not have a high school diploma, and only 6% of children that age out of foster care graduate from college. And that's a sad, really unfortunate statistic, especially given that there are several financial opportunities, scholarship opportunities for these kids. And then another one is the availability of resources to meet daily needs. And that could be due to neglect, income, unemployment on the part of the parents. So, contributing factors, these are some specific concerns. We'll go into this more in a little bit, but they definitely have an increased rate of health problems. There's greater risk for mental illness and higher risk, a major difference or increased risk for adolescent parenting. You can see 2/3 of females that are prior foster children have at least one child by 24. Most of them have at more than one. 1/3 of males that were in foster care have at least one child by 24, and the majority of these youth that are adolescent parents are either living in foster care or back with a parent, but they're usually not able to live on their own. And the other really sad statistic of this is intergenerational transmission of child abuse. They found that parents who experienced abuse as a child were 5 times more likely to abuse their own children and 1.4 times more likely to neglect their own children. Parents who experienced neglect were twice as likely to abuse and neglect their children. And you compare that to parents who did not experience any maltreatment at only 0.4% of abusing or neglecting their children. So that's just unfortunate too, to see the cycle of all these just continues to perpetuate. Some of the root causes of the health disparities for this population: socioeconomical stress, like mentioned, a lot of them come from poverty, parents are unemployed, which all of that leads to a lack of resources, a lack of support. Obviously, these children have very limited family support, friend support. They don't have a consistent neighborhood and community, but also a lack of support for their parents. Often these parents come from the same situation that their children are now in, and so they lack the support of family, friends, neighbors, a community that play a big part in helping them to kind of pull themselves out of this cycle. Family stress is a big one. There's a high rate of domestic violence, tumultuous relationships, separation, divorce, single parenting. All of these things lead to increased stress that only perpetuate the problem. Mental illness is another big one. A lot of parents that end up having their children taken away have pre-existing mental illness. Some of these children that are put into foster care have a pre-existing mental illness, which makes it challenging for their parent to care for them appropriately. These parents and children both can suffer from low self-confidence, shame, guilt. They're often overwhelmed. All of these just kind of have a domino effect that lead to the poor outcomes in this population. As far as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very few of these needs are actually met in these children. In some cases, they may have a safe place to live and have food, but a lot of times, even just the physiological needs are unmet. And definitely, safety, obviously their safety wasn't met. They have been taken away and out of that environment. They don't have that love and belonging from their family, which makes it hard for them to develop self-esteem. And then to even we've seen with these children that age out of foster care, they don't go on to be able to fulfill self-actualization. Their functional level is often, they often struggle just to even find work and make money. There's a high rate of poverty and abuse and drug use, and their likely health outcomes, they continue the cycle of abuse, neglect, mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, all these health problems, and they often experience that themselves and can cause those in their own children. Communicable diseases or infections. Really, the biggest one for them is sexually transmitted infections, and found that foster youth are 3 to 14 times more likely to contract an STI compared to non-foster youth. And that's due to, several factors. They don't have the support and the education on healthy sex practices and protecting themselves. And so that obviously that only adds more to the problem. Non-communicable diseases or infections, there's a high rate of mental illness, either that was pre-existing, like I mentioned, or most of the time these mental illnesses are caused by this really rough life that these kids have led, and that causes a lot of instances of depression, anxiety, ADD and ADHD, and behavior and conduct issues. They also experience many developmental delays. A lot of them are neglected, especially during those first few years where there's just a lot of developmental changes happening, and they don't have the engagement and the support and the nourishment that they need to even be able to just develop basic speech, hearing, vision, and even activity milestones. They often face more physical problems. Usually, this is just due to lack of health care because of socioeconomical status. They don't have the money, the means to access health care. So they found that these children face more instances of obesity and asthma. And as far as self care and self harm, and these kids just don't have a good example of what self care is. And that leads to the decreased likelihood of college attendance. They often face unemployment, or they have a hard time maintaining employment. They engage in risky behaviors. They end up in poverty, and they suffer from poor physical and mental health. They've found that 32% of youth in foster care report having thoughts of self-harm. That's almost triple what non-foster care youth report. And then risk for harm and being harmed and harming others. Again, it's the abuse, the neglect, the poor health care, and just overall care that they has been inflicted on them by others. And then they also often get stuck in that cycle where they perpetuate it and contribute into this cycle. They end up in the same cycle, and their children are usually abused, neglected, same thing that they were subjected to. And they also engage in more criminal activity and adolescent parenting, which only adds to the problem. So all these things just add to the major health disparities that this population faces, and it just shows the need that the country has, and the world really, for stable foster parents to take these kids in and be able to give them a stable, healthy home.